Hey guys, it's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. I'm a professional dog trainer. I work exclusively with dogs facing behavioral issues, including anxiety. And a lot of times what we see is that these dogs are not able to take treats because they are so overwhelmed, or perhaps they're just not valuing treats enough when their trigger is around. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you 4 strategies using positive reinforcement dog training methods. However, I recommend you stay until the end because each technique levels up on itself. What that means is, like, you're going to try activity number 1. If that doesn't work, you're going to move on to activity number 2. If that doesn't work, you're going to move to activity number 3, and so forth. So make sure you stay till the end so that you can experiment with all of these techniques and see which one works best for your dog. Let's get into it. The first technique I want you to implement is to start working where your dog is below threshold. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean over and under threshold in just a moment, but first I want to give you an example. Let's say you were working with a juicy flavor of turkey or a juicy treat of chicken, whatever. And inside the house, you bring that chicken out and your dog is so willing to do the sit, so willing to do the down, so willing to do whatever you ask. They are ravenous for that chicken. It is the prime reinforcement that they're eager for. But then you walk out into the trigger environment where the trigger is present, and all of a sudden that exact same treat, that exact same turkey, that exact same chicken, whatever, is no longer valuable enough. Your dog is no longer seeking to eat it. Well, what this tells you in this context is that it has nothing to do with the treat. It has nothing to do with the fact that your dog just doesn't value the treat or that the treat isn't invaluable. It has everything to do with the context of the trigger. First, recognize that food is a primary reinforcement, which is a big, fancy scientific way of saying that food is always valuable. It would take your dog to be very sick and ill to deny food, and even then, some dogs don't have that impulse control even in that condition. So if your dog is not taking a treat in a specific context where the trigger is present, then that is a huge red flag that they are too overwhelmed to be able to eat. Now, here's what that means. When we talk about a dog being too overwhelmed to eat, another way of thinking this is over threshold. Okay, that is just a cute little way of saying that your dog's fight, flight, or freeze response is engaged. And what ends up happening when that fight, flight, or freeze response is engaged is that there's so much adrenaline coursing through your dog's body. It is such a taxing, stressful moment on your dog's body that it's actually going to start to dim down some of the more automatic systems. For example, the digestion system. Suddenly your dog's body is literally not sending as many resources to the digestion system because it's reallocating those resources, the blood, the oxygen, the calories, whatever you want to think of it as. It's reallocating those resources to the fight, flight, or freeze response. And so your dog's body is literally going, man, we can't worry about digestion right now. We literally cannot worry about food right now because we are in such a fight, flight, or freeze response that is our number 1 priority. And so when you think of it that way, the logical conclusion then is, well, I need to work in a training situation, in a training context where my dog is not in that fight, flight, or freeze response. In other words, my dog is under threshold. And this is the technique that I want you to be operating out of. It's something called counter conditioning and desensitization. I have a full-length video that is 50 minutes long, and I know it's a long tutorial, but it is so in-depth. I'll link it right here. It's also in the description box below. I really recommend that if you are looking to implement counter conditioning and desensitization into your dog's training and you haven't tried it yet, that is your very next video. That is your very next step. But number 1 objective is, at least for this technique, is we are working below threshold. Let's move on to number 2. Now, if you have been working under threshold already and your dog still isn't valuing treats, you've tried doing different types of treats, different, what you would perceive different values, some are higher, some are lower value treats, and it's still not working out for you. Or perhaps it is working, but it's not functional. Perhaps you can't translate the treat feeding to a bunch of different contexts. Well, in that case, you're going to move on to technique number 2. And for this, I like to call this the enrichment list, okay? Enrichment is a big fancy way of saying giving your dog what your dog needs and desires. Okay, so sometimes we think about enrichment in terms of play and in terms of, like, food puzzles and a bunch of toys from Petco. But actually enrichment is much more encompassing than that. Enrichment includes sleep, water, sniffing, rolling around in grass, doing anything that dogs do. And so what I want you to do at the end of this video, as soon as you are ready for step 2, is I want you to bring out a pen and pencil and paper, and I want you to write down all of the things your dog enjoys. Don't worry about putting them in any particular order. Don't worry about doing anything fancy with the list right now. This is just a brain dump. I just want you to sit down and write out all of the things you think your dog enjoys, even if it's just mild enjoyment. And don't be afraid to return to this list. So maybe this is a list you keep on your fridge, and as soon as an idea hits you, you go to the list and you write it down. Once you have a pretty solid list, I would say anywhere from 20 to 30 different activities that your dog, ranging from mildly excited to overzealous, overjoyed excitement, ranging in that level of enrichment. Once you have that list, what I want you to do is cross-reference the activities to the contexts under which they make sense. So here's what I mean, for example. Let's say you are working on getting your dog to feel comfortable at the park. Well, that would be a perfect condition for your dog to practice sniffing. It may not be the perfect condition for your dog to practice swimming because there's no pool around, right? You would want to pick a situation or an enrichment form that makes sense for the context. For example, going to sniff the bush, or rolling around in the grass, or getting belly rubs from mom with a big laugh, right? You would want to pick an enrichment form that makes sense for the context. And then what I want you to do is I want you to start pairing that level of enrichment, that type of enrichment, with when the trigger is around. And again, we're working below threshold. So what this means is that your dog is not all consumed by the trigger. In fact, if the trigger is around and your dog can't do anything but stare at it or bark at it or lunge at it or otherwise react at it, if that's the case, then you are still working over threshold in this case, and you need to build distance or lower the criteria in some other way by changing the environment, changing the action that the trigger is doing, changing the appearance of the trigger, whatever it is. You need to lower the criteria of the trigger and then try the enrichment activity again. Now, practicing this enrichment with the trigger around can be what we would call like changing the association, pairing something good with what your dog likes. That is definitely one way to look at it. But personally, I actually promote that you look at it as more of a desensitization experience. And so what this means is that it's actually operating like exposure therapy. Assuming you are working at a really far distance or really low criteria, such that your dog is far under threshold, very comfortable with the trigger and the environment, everything is going swell, and also they're doing this other enrichment which has nothing to do with treats, has nothing to do with a formal reinforcer. Assuming all of those things are true, you're actually just giving your dog the opportunity to be exposed to the trigger at such a mild rate that they can actually afford to just watch it and see what is the outcome of this event. And there can be a lot of learning in that stage. So if the treats are not actually working in a more formal delivery, get rid of the treats, lower the criteria exponentially, and focus on enrichment in those moments. Technique number 3 is something called BAT 2.0 by Grisha Stewart. Now, this is also known as behavior adjustment training. You're probably just going to hear it as BAT. She does have a book called BAT 2.0 by Grisha Stewart. I highly recommend it. Again, this is especially optimal for dogs that don't take treats around their trigger. And here's why. First of all, the entire training protocol requires no treats at all. It is completely just free of any sort of formal, overt reinforcement, okay? The reinforcement comes from the experience. Now, there are pros and cons to BAT 2.0, and I want to emphasize right now that BAT 2.0 is not for every single dog. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why you'll notice that it's in step 3. I want you to try the other 2 first before you go on to step 3. And the reason is because BAT 2.0, while ideal for anxious dogs that won't take treats, while all of those things are true, from a functional end, from a guardian end, it's actually a little bit more painstaking, such that it requires more time on your end. It can be a longer recovery journey potentially. It requires a lot more patience from you, and it requires a lot less training mentality. Okay, so the reason I bring it at the third step, and it's not like the very first thing I suggest, is because ideally you're saving this for the dogs that really, really, really need it, and you're not necessarily jumping straight into it right out of the get-go. Now, here is the Reader's Digest version of how BAT 2.0, the protocol, works. However, again, I'm gonna send you to that book for the full expansion on how to implement, okay? What I want you to do is think about playing follow the leader. BAT is basically follow the leader on steroids, okay? And mind you, you are not the leader in this equation. Actually, your dog is the leader. So what you want to think about is, as soon as your dog takes one step, you take one step. As soon as your dog takes another step, you take another step. As soon as your dog takes another 2 steps and goes to a sniff, you take those 2 steps and go to a sniff. And interestingly, this can be very difficult for guardians because it's a new way of walking with your dog, right? Generally speaking, when we're walking with our dog, we think that we have to give them direction on, like, okay, we're going to this stop, or we're going to this location, or we're doing that. We act as sort of the navigator or the guide of the walk. And in follow the leader, in this BAT protocol, it's actually reverse. You're intentionally taking your dog to an environment, say an open park or an old, schoolyard, it doesn't matter. Take your dog to somewhere that is safe for the most part, and you can afford to let your dog control where he walks. Again, it's imperative that you're not thinking about follow the leader is 24/7. It's not like as soon as you walk out your front door, you're immediately letting your dog guide you. That may not be practical. It may not even be safe. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to take your dog to a location that you already know has a reasonable amount of control, and your dog is gonna behave in that environment relatively safely. And then you're gonna play follow the leader. And all I want you to do is let your dog guide how close or how far away from the trigger they want to be. You're not taking the time to point out the trigger. You don't need to say, hey, Fluffy, look, there's another trigger over there. You don't need to make the trigger do a dance. You don't need to make the trigger make noise. None of that. Why? Well, first and foremost, because you have an anxious dog and they probably already know where it is, right? If you have a phobia, you're very aware of where that scary thing is at all times. I'm afraid of clowns. I can guarantee you, if I know there's a clown in this space, I am hyper scanning so that I know exactly where that clown is at all times. That's how you want to think about your dog. They are very aware of where that trigger is. And even if they're not necessarily looking directly at it, they're certainly smelling it. They are hearing it. They are very aware of where it is. You do not need to point it out or make it an extreme thing. Instead, allow your dog to navigate the environment on his terms. Allow him to tell you when he wants to get closer and investigate the trigger and when he doesn't. Now, this is also an exercise in being aware of what the other trigger is doing. This is another reason why I save BAT for special circumstances, is because ideally in a BAT setup, you are controlling what the trigger is doing and where they are. So for example, you would need to have a helper person, a helper dog, a helper whatever to control, so to speak, what the trigger is doing. Whereas if you are working, with a more counter conditioning or desensitization approach, in that case, you can actually afford to just use normal people on the street that are living their lives a little bit more freely. So again, ideally in this situation, while your dog is in control of navigating the follow the leader environment, you are actually controlling what the trigger does to a certain extent. The trigger is not going to start jumping up and down and doing jumping jacks, right? You can really afford to make sure that the trigger is doing safe things, or at least what your dog perceives to be safe. Now, the fourth technique is to actually consider behavioral medication, or otherwise known as anxiety medication. Now, before you exit out, because I know that there can be a stigma, I want to expand a little bit on this, okay? There is a reason why I put this as step 4. And the reason is because I know that many guardians, many veterinarians, even many vet behaviorists want you to try other things first before just jumping right into, medication. It's not that medication needs to be a last resort. Indeed, there are many dogs that would benefit from behavior meds happening sooner in their life. Their lives would be a lot easier if they had started the medication sooner. So I'm not suggesting that it has to be a last resort. What I am suggesting is you want to think about anytime you're living with your dog, anytime you are waking up in the morning and your dog is in your vicinity, they are giving you constant information. They are constantly giving you data. And the reason I leave step 4 or behavior meds for step 4 is that you can really think of 1 through 3 as just data collection, right? You're running constant experiments, you're asking your dog a bunch of questions, and you're waiting to see what their response is. Sometimes those responses are gonna come really fast. You're gonna be able to move through techniques 1 and through 3, in a matter of 2 weeks, get a lot of data and go, shoot, we need to go to the vet, right? On the other hand, perhaps it's a slower process. Perhaps you're going through techniques 1 through 3 several weeks at a time, and several months later you conclude, hey, my dog might benefit from anxiety medication. So it's not that you're saving anxiety medication as the very, 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 very last resort. It's actually just that you are trying to collect a lot of information from your dog in as an effective manner as possible. Think about you asking your dog a ton of questions every single time they're in your vicinity, and that is especially true if the trigger is also in the vicinity. And so if you are asking your dog questions and your dog continuously tells you, hey, this is really stressful for me, this is really difficult, this is really hard for me, this is causing me a lot of stress and pain and frustration. If all of those things are true, it's actually unethical to keep putting your dog in that situation, right? And this kind of leads me into the discussion of what anxiety medication is and what it's for. First of all, anxiety medication should not be a mere sedative. Let me say that again. Anxiety medication for the purpose of lowering your dog's stress levels is not with the intention of sedation. There is a purpose for sedation in the veterinary world that has nothing to do with treating your dog's anxiety, okay? So if you are giving your dog a medication and you're noticing that they become very drowsy, very out of it, unmotivated to do anything, if you're noticing that is not for the anxiety purpose, okay? You need to talk to your vet about whether or not you need that for some other purpose. Maybe you do need sedation for some other thing, but it is not for the purpose of getting your dog to feel comfortable around his trigger so that he'll take treats. That is not it. Okay? What anxiety medication should be doing is lowering your dog's stress. It can actually work in 2 different ways. It can change how your dog actually feels about a particular trigger such that he's less likely to go over threshold when the trigger is around. That's one way an anxiety medication can work. The second way that an anxiety medication may work is that it changes or speeds up the recovery time. So once your dog does go over threshold, the recovery time after that and your dog's ability to come back to what would be considered homeostasis is faster. Now, I'm not at liberty, because I'm just a professional trainer, I'm not at liberty to tell you which medications do what and how and why. Instead, you need to go to the vet and you need to have that conversation with them, okay? However, I did do a wonderful 2-part series on anxiety medication where I had the assistance of a professional veterinary technician who works closely with vet behaviorists, and that is a really in-depth analysis of how behavior meds work, what you need to know. And that would be linked in the description box, most importantly. If you are considering having a conversation with your veterinarian about behavior meds, go in knowledgeable. Go into the conversation with your veterinarian or your vet behaviorist with knowledge. That is why those 2 YouTube videos are there, because they are meant to empower you with information so that when you enter the conversation, you don't feel like you're getting gatekeeped, you don't feel like you're being sidestepped, you're certainly not being talked down to, because you're able to speak the vet's language. That's really the purpose of those 2 videos, and I can't encourage you enough to watch them. Now let's say that your dog is all of a sudden on behavior medication. You found the right dosage, you found the right prescription, everything is rainbows and butterflies. You're like, ha, my dog is starting to feel better. Now you need to go back into step 1 through 3 and move through those techniques methodically until you find the right one. The reason is because behavior medication is not meant to be a standalone fix. It is meant to complement those other techniques. So perhaps your dog was not able to do one of those 3 techniques while not on behavior meds, but now that your dog has the medication, has the anxiety medication, one of those 3, if not all 3 of them, will absolutely help your dog. And that's how you want to think of it, is like, okay, we got through 1 through 3 without anxiety medications, they didn't work, now we have one, let's go through it again and find the one that works. Throughout your dog's recovery journey, throughout your dog's desensitization of his trigger, you really want to be thinking about, am I in a conversation with my dog? Do I feel like I am asking my dog questions and they are able to give me answers that I can then interpret? And vice versa, is my dog asking me any questions that I can answer for him and give him clear information? You're trying to communicate more than just simply, these are the things that are happening and these are the things I want you to do. It's actually a conversation where your dog has a role in what happens in the equation. It's actually a question and answer. Think of it like a Q&A event, right? You're going to ask your dog a question, see like, how do you feel about the trigger if they're doing this? How do you feel about the trigger if you and I do that? How do you feel about the trigger if the trigger is doing nothing, but we're doing a whole lot of something? You want to think about it as you're constantly asking your dog a question and you're leaving space for your dog to be able to give an answer. The thing is, throughout this training process, is that your dog's answers absolutely will change as he learns and as he starts to problem solve more. So while you may ask your dog a question in one context on one day, and he can give you a certain answer, you ask that exact same question with the exact same setup and the exact same trigger, a week later, and your dog may give you a completely different answer. So let me give you a practical example of this. When we were working with a dog in the RRP, her name was Deja, she would become very anxious, and one of the very first things that would go from her stress repertoire, one of the very first things that she would lose is her willingness to eat. So as soon as she was even feeling mildly distressed, her willingness to eat just went right out of the window and said, no thank you, Mom. But when we finally got her on the right anxiety medication and she was at a far enough distance and a low enough criteria, Amy, her guardian, was able to ask Deja, like, okay, what do you feel about this? And how do you feel about this setup, this, design of the training event? And suddenly her dog was able to eat, right? So you want to be thinking about, you're in a constant Q&A with your dog, and their answers will probably change as their mood and their education and their awareness changes. If you enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you get notified when I drop a new video. Smash the like button to help us in the YouTube algorithm. Consider watching one of these 2 videos next. All of the videos I referenced in this video are in the description box, and I will see you guys in the next video.